Okay, welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whatever you believe, whoever you love, you're welcome here. My name is James Carroll. I'm a religious education instructor at the Unitarian Church. And this is one of our comparative religions series. This one is an introduction to Islam. We haven't done these comparative religions in a while because we've been doing the biblical scholarship section, but it's time to pivot back and do some variety. So today we're going to talk about Islam. I gave a lecture at the Unitarian Church on Islam 10 years ago in 2015, focused on the Kaaba and the use of the Kaaba, or looking at the Kaaba as a temple in light of the temple topology from John Lundquist and others. And I compared it to ancient temple topologies of space, time, sacredness. And that was an interesting lecture, but I haven't done Islam since then, and that was long before we were recording these, so some people online have specifically asked for Islam. It's crazy that we have a comparative religion course, and we've never talked about the second largest religion in the world, which is Islam. So we're going to try to remedy that today to the best of our ability. Today, first of all, we do have a webpage, sites.google.com, view comparative religion, and it should have links to the videos of the different lectures, different classes we've taught, as well as links to some of the additional resources that I've recommended, etc. Yeah, go ahead, Elroy.
Yes, if Islam is the second largest, how big a fraction is that of the total?
Let's talk about that in just a minute. I'll actually show the actual numbers, and so I'm not making them up. I'll actually look them up and show you what they are. So today we're just going to define Islam, talk about the demographics, where I'll answer Elroy's question. We'll give an overview of the history of Islam, not the actual deep dive, and it's just kind of the beginnings of what it's all about in the history. Some of the core teachings and practices, especially the 5 pillars, and then we'll give some recommended resources and further reading. This is a very elementary overview. It's the very beginning of where anyone would want to start with Islam. There's not a lot of depth here, but I'm hoping this will be part of a larger series where we'll go into each of these elements in some greater depth. So this is just that introduction. So first of all, what does Islam mean? Islam is a term in Arabic that means submission or surrender, but it also has in it the Hebrew, or the Semitic roots, SLM, salam, which goes into Hebrew as salam, which means peace. We also get that in shalom and Jerusalem, the city of shalom, peace. And so Islam is the religion of, a Muslim, then is one who surrenders. So Islam is to surrender, a Muslim is someone who surrenders. So basically, Islam can be thought of as the religion where one finds peace by surrendering to God. This is also where the common phrase, Islam is a religion of peace, comes from, that you hear used polemically all the time, especially by people who want to either stop the conflicts between the West and Islam or want to produce apologetics for Islam. If you've been in many of my comparative religion classes, you know I like this rubric for understanding a religion by Stephen Prothero, where he talks about how each religion proposes a different problem, that all of the religions realize there's something wrong with our society, we just don't know what it is, and so each one proposes a different problem, and therefore a different solution and a different technique for overcoming the problem and achieving the solution, along with some exemplars. This is from Stephen Prothero's book, God is Not One. So for example, Christianity, the problem is sin. The solution is salvation through faith and sometimes works, depending on whether you're a Calvinist or a Protestant or of other denominational form. And the exemplars are Christ, the saints, the prophets, that sort of thing. In Hinduism, the problem is, the rebirth of samsara, and the solution is to end rebirth. Similar thing with Buddhism, except the problem is more closely aligned with just suffering in general. Samsara wouldn't be a problem, except samsara involves suffering. Suffering is the problem, so we want to overcome suffering. In Judaism, the problem is exile, and the solution is a return. Confucianism, the problem is chaos. In Taoism, it's artificiality. The new atheists like to pretend the problem is religion itself, and then they propose the solution of reason, atheism, etc. But in Islam, the solution is pride and self-sufficiency. or otherwise known as idolatry. They connect the two, and Muhammad kind of arose in an environment where Christianity and Judaism were vying with pagan polytheistic idolatrous worship, in the sense that they used idols in their worship. And Judaism and Christianity were talking about, how idols were wrong and idols were evil, and Islam grew up in that environment. So it makes some sense that Muhammad would, as someone who embraced the monotheism of Christianity and Judaism, but then disagreed with them on certain points and decided and became his own prophet, that created a new variant of monotheism that arose out of the Christianity and Judaism in its environment, and saw as its prime enemy the polytheism of paganism. And so in that environment, the problem was pride of thinking we are independent of God, or of associating something else with God, which is a variant of pride, worshiping the works of your own hands, idolatry. And so the solution to that is to submit to God's will. Submission is the solution to the problem of pride, and the techniques for achieving it are the 5 pillars and the various rules of the Islamic community, which we'll talk about, Sharia law, etc. And then the exemplars, of course, Muhammad and his various companions, and if you're a Sunni, the Imams, who are seen as Muhammad's successors, if you're a Shia Muslim, excuse me. So that kind of thing both lies to you in the sense that it oversimplifies, but it also very quickly gets at the heart of things. And as long as you recognize that the heart we're getting at here is only part of the story, that's okay. Very quickly we can see the heart of the matter. For Christianity, the problem is sin, salvation through the suffering and death of Christ, which we achieve through faith and works with Christ and the saints as our examples. And in Islam, the problem is our own pride. Sin is not the problem. Sin is a symptom of pride. There is no such thing as original sin. There's no such thing as a sacrifice, the death of Christ, for example, to pay for sins. We just have to repent, turn around, and be forgiven so that we don't suffer and burn. And the techniques for doing that are the 5 pillars and the laws of the community, Sharia law. The God of Islam is called Allah. This has caused several people to claim that Muslims worship, quote, a different God. Certainly Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Mormonism. Mormonism also gets accused of worshiping a different God, all these things. Certainly all of those religions talk about God in different ways. And there are fundamentalists who will tell you that means they worship a different God. But the conception of the God that Muslims have is of the being who is the same God as the God of the Bible. They simply believe that the Bible has been corrupted, the stories are not accurately portrayed, and a new revelation from that same God has been given, and Muhammad is the prophet of the God, the same God as the God of the Bible, the New Testament, and the Old Testament, the same as the God of the Hebrews and the Jews. And so Muslims believe that they all three worship the same God. Of course, there are fundamentalist Christians who deny that fact, but again, I think they're just being fundamentalists about if you don't describe God exactly right in your text, you're worshiping the wrong God, that sort of thing. Now, the etymology of the word is that it is the same word as the Hebrew Elohim. Really, it's just the Arabic variant of it. They come from the same roots. They have the same background, the same beginning. So in Arabic, now, by the way, anyone listening to this lecture, my Arabic pronunciation is pathetic. I know not how to pronounce a lot of these words. I took 1 semester of modern Arabic while I was a student in Jerusalem. I remember none of it. And so don't expect me to do this right, but I'm going to do my best. But all is the definite article, the. And in Hebrew and in Arabic, you attach the definite article to the word. It like becomes a prefix to the word. So La is God, Allah is the God. And in Hebrew, you would say the same thing. You'd say Ha Elo. And again, Elo, Allah, these are the same roots. We've just attached the definite article to the front, specifically to say the God, meaning not one of the polytheistic pagan deities. It's the one true, only monotheistic deity. with the same, again, it's the same word as Hebrew Elohim, translated God, just the Arabic variant. And I should point out Arabic and Hebrew are very related. I do know a little bit of Hebrew, so that sort of helps my Arabic pronunciation, but not a lot. All right. So this graph shows you where most Muslims live. We think of Islam as a Middle Eastern religion, right? So we think of, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, Yemen, as our Muslim countries when we think about Islam. Sometimes we think about Egypt, but in reality, Islam is a majority religion in a lot of the countries, if not all of them, in northern Africa. But some of the largest population of Muslims are found in the Southeast Asia area, down in here.
I wouldn't put Malaysia as 90 to 100%. I think Malaysia is more like 65 to 80%.
Interesting. I'm not sure. That color, 65, 80. Yeah, that's probably the color they're trying to imply. But it is certainly a Muslim majority nation, and because it's such a high population area, the majority of the world's Muslims actually live in Southeast Asia, not in the Middle East. But we interact with them mostly in the Middle East, often through conflicts involving oil, terrorism, etc. And so we think of Islam as a religion of the Middle East, when really Southeast Asia is where a lot of the Muslims live, the world's Muslims. So yeah, I think what you said, 65% is consistent with this graph. Yeah. Yeah, on the projector it's a little harder to see, but yeah, this is very dark and this is a little bit lighter, so it's probably down in here, down in this color. But here we have, now this is even harder to read. These are small, I apologize, but I pulled these charts from Pew, so it's kind of the best we can do, but I'll try to read them off to you. This is the percent of the world's population in 2010 and projected out to 2050. And so this is in percent, this is in raw numbers. So Muslims right now, I'm sorry, that's off this is, there's about 1.6 million Muslims today. In 2010, that was 10 years ago, and there's projected to be 2.76 billion. Sorry, so that was a B with a billion, not a million. 2.76 billion by 2050, which makes them, within kind of horseshoes and hand grenades, equal with Christianity. So Christianity is growing, the number of Christians is growing, but kind of as a fraction of the world population, it's flat. But Islam is growing, both in terms of raw numbers and in terms of the fraction of the world's population. And what we see is the unaffiliated are actually in decline. Now, this is counterintuitive to us because in the United States, the unaffiliated are growing, and there's a lot of people in Europe and the United States who like to crow about the inevitable victory of secularism, and they're European American centric when they talk that way. The rest of the world is becoming dramatically more religious over time, not less, and we'll show you why that is happening in just a minute. The growth rate of Islam is 76%, whereas Christianity is only 35%, and the unaffiliated is down around 9%, and Buddhism is actually shrinking. Is it because of conversion? Are a lot of people converting to Islam? And the answer is Islam is growing due to conversions, but the unaffiliated are primarily growing due to conversion. That's probably not surprising because most people are religious, and so as unaffiliated grow, they grow through conversion, and they are growing, but the fraction of the population is not. So this is where the unaffiliated growth comes from, is almost all conversion. But Islam is growing through conversion as well. But that's not why it's doing so well, because remember, it's growing faster than the unaffiliated. But the unaffiliated are growing faster than Islam through conversion. So what's happening? And the answer is birth rates. Muslim countries also have, on average, higher birth rates than Christian ones, and much higher birth rates than secular nations. And this is why worldwide Islam is growing. You see the Islamic birth rate is much higher. And even if you just look at the fertility rate kind of by country, you immediately see what's happening. The countries that have high levels of Islam are also the countries that have high birth rates. And so, this is just projected growth, or past growth, for different regions of the world. And notice East Asia and the Pacific and the Southeast Asia. And again, you see it in the age distribution. The percent under 15, Muslims have a larger youth population, which is indicative of a growing by birth rate population. Notice the unaffiliated are the worst in this case. The unaffiliated, by the way, tend to be old, tend to be white, and tend to be male. Especially the atheist portion of that tend to be old, white, male. Are the ones that identify at least as atheist. Again, these are averages. Every time I say something like this, someone likes to raise their hand and say, but I buck that trend. And yes, you do. We're talking about on average, right? We're not talking about individuals. And in fact, then if you just kind of project this out, this is what happens when you go out to about 2100. Now, the problem with projecting this out is no one can predict the future, least of all demographers. These demographic trends almost certainly will not continue. Things don't continue. Things change, and they change dramatically, and they surprise you, and they shock you, and then everyone's like, oh, wow, that's a big shift, right? In fact, the rise of the unaffiliated was itself a big shift. And so that happens by changing demographic trends. So if you project the trends out, we are destined by 2070 to be a Muslim majority world, surpassing Christianity, if trends continue. And I don't expect that they will, but I also can't predict in what way they will shift, right? They could shift in any direction. When you project this far into the future, there should be a large amount of uncertainty involved. Did you have I thought maybe you were raising your hand. Okay, so that's the demographics. That's kind of where Muslims live, how many of them there are, and whether they're growing, shrinking, and kind of what the future of the world holds. So I think it behooves us to understand Islam. If the majority of the world's population is potentially going to be Islamic by the time I'm 95 years old. Maybe I won't live that long, but possibly within my own lifetime. So let's now talk about the history, where Islam came from, the basics of their teachings, and the basics of their practice. And again, basics. This is a very high level, quick overview. We will have more classes on Islam, and we will dive deeper into each of these topics in the future. But I want to give kind of a quick overview first, so we all kind of have a background. Most of you will probably know all of this, but it's still useful to have a background. So Muhammad was born is really the beginning of Islam, has to start with Muhammad. He was born in Mecca in about 570 CE. About 610, he says that he was off praying in a cave where he liked to go kind of by himself and meditate, where he was visited by an angel who said he was Gabriel and told him to recite, meaning to repeat the words, a recitation of a direct revelation. This is important for understanding the nature of the Quran, but this is the beginning of the Quran. Muhammad recited the words that Gabriel gave to him, and those words became chronologically the first surah of the Quran, surah being kind of chapter. Not the first in the book if you pick it up today. The book seems to be organized mostly by the length of the surahs, the chapters, rather than chronologically. But this is the first one was then given, and it was supposed to be a recitation of the words of God as given to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. He began to teach some of this stuff and was immediately persecuted, of course, unsurprisingly, like every other person who said something like this was. And by the way, most of you know I was a Mormon before I came here at the Unitarian Church. It's really hard not to compare him to Joseph Smith, but I actually suggest that even if I wasn't a Mormon with background in that would be a really good comparison, because here we have a man who stood up, said he was a prophet, was visited by an angel, got himself a new book, starts talking about the new book, preaching it, and immediately is persecuted. The similarities between the two are much deeper than that, from polygamy to child brides, it goes on and on and on, to military campaigns and the whole deal. The only difference is Joseph was killed and Muhammad wasn't, but nevertheless, there are a lot of very coherent and interesting similarities And I will try not to overly lean on them because of my background, but it's hard not to at least make the comparison because there's so many interesting similarities. But he was persecuted, so he fled, which again happened to the Mormons. But the difference is, and this is an important difference, Muhammad returned. Joseph Smith tried to return. He actually chumped up a legion and marched with an army back to take back his own, and failed. Muhammad, however, succeeded, and he returned, captured Mecca. There were several very pitched, exciting battles. There's great war stories I can tell you, great strategy and interesting military maneuvers, and finally he ended up capturing Mecca, where he went into the Kaaba, the central shrine at Mecca, and there was a recurring pilgrimage that happened there in Mecca to this shrine, and it was the central source of one of the central sources of their material wealth. So instead of claiming that this pilgrimage was a pagan thing and outlawing it, he cleansed the shrine of its idols. He claimed that the shrine had been built by Adam and refurbished by Abraham and was now being refurbished by him, and made pilgrimage to Mecca one of the core principles of Islam. He then proceeded to gather armies and conquer almost the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula before his death, which he died in the 8th of June, 1632, when, of course, the Quran it ends with the last recitation, which was given slightly before his death. And after his death, there was a disagreement, and I'm not going to do the details of said disagreement because that is the subject for a History of Islam lecture, which should be its own lecture that I'm hoping to give at some point. But after his death, there was a disagreement about his successor and how succession should work in Islam. Some people believe that his son-in-law, Ali, should be the proper successor, and others believe that it should just be the leaders of his community, some of his closest friends, as chosen by a consensus view. And this caused a split in Islam between Sunni and Shia Muslims. The vast majority of Muslims are Sunni in this light green, and Shia is dominated in the areas of dark green. Notice Iraq and Iran predominantly. And so, by the way, the political and military conflicts that have recently happened in Iran, you cannot understand these except in light of this split. Iran has been trying to destabilize the nations around it because of the Sunni-Shia split predominantly for years, and this is why the U.S. could bomb Iran and have a nation like Saudi Arabia, majority Muslim, not be terribly angry. They had strong words. And again, what's happening here is that Saudi Arabia and Iran do not get along, and the reason is rooted in this conflict. So I believe that it's important to understand kind of the geopolitical aspects of what's happening in the world and in the Middle East. You have to have some background in the history of Islam, because Islam plays a role. You can't understand what's going on over there without understanding Islam and the Islamic history. Doctrinally, the Sunni Islam Muslims are much more interested in, they're more like Protestants in the sense that they believe in the consensus of the community. The community chose the leaders by consensus, and that's how the new leaders of the community were chosen. And in Shia Islam, it was Muhammad's descendants, son-in-law, and then his child, and they became exemplars who have some element of infallibility, much like the Catholics. So you can think of it as the Catholic-Protestant divide.
Can you say
Yeah.
which again, James?
Yeah. So the Sunni Islam are the ones who kind of chose by consensus, and Shia are the ones who believed it should be in the line of Muhammad's family. And so they are much more akin to the Catholics in the sense that they have a top-down leader who would dictate the proper way. Now, in 12er Shia Islam, the last imam, in the imam is this chosen leader descendant, went into hiding and will return at the end of time. So they're kind of believe in the descendant through Muhammad without having one actually to reign for them, because the line has been broken and they're waiting for him to return at the end of time or something like this. Now again, that is dramatically oversimplified. So we will do this in better detail at a later date. But I want to give you kind of something to put your head around. Catholic, Protestant, right? The consensus of the community versus an infallible leader, Shia, Sunni. So Islam is a religion that has sacred texts, like most of them do. The primary text is the Quran. This is the recitations of Muhammad as dictated by the angel. He would get these revelations through the power of God. I believe there was some variations in how he said they came. Sometimes the angel spoke to him. Sometimes he heard them in his mind. I need to go back and redo that. It's been a long time. And they were not written down during his lifetime, but they were memorized. And there are people today who have them all memorized and can recite them all. And so I think that the skepticism we in the West have of anything memorized is probably not applicable here. They were written in poetry, and a lot of the beauty of the verses isn't in the meaning so much as in the sound. This is sacred sound. If you want, if you're a Catholic and you want to partake of the nature of God inside of you, you do it by taking communion. If you're a Muslim, you do it by hearing the Quran, because when you hear the Quran, you hear the literal words of God. That is the sound that God makes when God speaks. These are the words of God. And so, as spoken in the language, that God spoke them. And so, it's the beauty of the spoken word of the Quran that is so moving to people, and they will often use the idea that it is too beautiful to have been written by a man. That is the same sort of thing that is often said about the Book of Mormon, but the Book of Mormon doesn't have the same beautiful poetry. It's actually kind of dry, and it came to pass. But it's the complexity of the book no mortal could have written, right? They use the same argument to defend the book. But that's the Quran. It's the recitations specifically given to Muhammad, memorized during his lifetime, written down after, and recited. And one of the primary, therefore, means of worship in Islamic society is to recite the Quran. And doctrinally speaking, if you want to answer an argument or a discussion, or you want to know how you should live, the Quran is the primary source of information. It trumps all the others because this is God's word. If there's a disagreement within the Quran itself, there is a principle where you take the later verses and they supersede the earlier verses. The next is the Hadith. The Hadith is the report or the accounts of Muhammad's life. Some of them written down by his wives, often. They'll be one of the primary sources, but often his followers and his family. And so each of these hadiths has a chain of transmission. This was told by so-and-so who told it to so-and-so who told it to so-and-so who wrote it down. And so each one will have a chain of transmission of the report, and if it has no chain of transmission, it was not preserved. So it required this chain of transmission, so you knew where it came from, and then the account of what Muhammad did. And there's a flourishing set of commentary. This is actually a volume of commentary on the hadith that is all about how reliable each hadith is. So these are not considered to be infallible. It is recognized that these are the accounts of people who remember Muhammad saying or doing things. It has information on how Muhammad kept his beard, to how he treated his wives, to how he treated his children, to how he ran the government, to how he determined punishments for criminals, to law, to what he said the law should be and how people should behave and how we should punish criminals. All of this sort of stuff is in the hadith, and all of it with these chains of transmission. And each of those chains of transmission then have commentaries supporting or denying them, arguing against them, arguing for them. If anything in the hadith then contradicts the Quran takes precedence, and you get the idea of how complicated this can be. And this is, of course, the origin, the backbone of the debates that surround how Islamic law functions.
It's a lot better than saying the whole thing is true.
Yes.
Because you have a way to work through inconsistencies.
That's right. Now, it's a little harder when you get to the Quran itself. I'll talk about, let's talk about that now. One of the issues that I often discuss is fundamentalism. So when I teach the biblical classes here, I don't care if you believe in God. I don't care if you don't believe in God. I think most of us here are atheists, but there's some theists here. There's some believers. There's some non-believers. Online, there's a lot of believers who watch my classes. I don't care if you believe or don't believe. But I do care if you have a fundamentalist view of the biblical text because it's historically impossible. And one of the points of the class is to show how that is historically impossible. There's lots of ways to interpret the text without that fundamentalist view. Right? The Bible, I'm going to contrast the Bible and the Quran for a minute. And I want to do this carefully because, again, we don't want to overgeneralize. But the Bible, there's a tradition that the first 5 books were written by Moses. But the Bible itself does not make that claim. That is not in the text anywhere. And in fact, if you read the text, it contradicts that claim because the Bible has passages that in those first 5 books that say, and it has been like this till today, implying that today is many years later. They talk about the death of Moses. Moses is spoken of in the third person. Right? The text itself does not make that claim. And even if it was written by Moses, it is not, the entire book at least, the words of God. Every once in a while, God will come down and speak to people in the book, but the book are the words of men who describe their experiences with God and then tell the myths of their ancestors, often thousands of years after the events that they're, hundreds at least of years, after the events they're describing. So they're telling the stories of their people, they're telling you about their experiences with the divine, and so it's easier for people to look at the Bible and go, I'm going to reject a fundamentalist view of this text. By fundamentalists, I mean perfect, inerrant Word of God. There are people who also will do something similar with the Quran. However, it is more difficult because, like the Book of Mormon, we have the same problem with the Book of Mormon, I might add, at least in its historicity. Now, the Book of Mormon has an internal sense that it's written by people and the people are imperfect, but its historicity has a chain, that is not the same as I'm telling the myths of my ancestors. It's this guy wrote this thing down, and you've got his words written, as he wrote them. And the Bible, and so the Quran goes a step further because all of the words are the recitation of God to Muhammad, memorized by his followers and written only a few hundred years later, at the latest. And so there is the majority opinion in Islam is that the Quran is infallible. There is a position that also says beyond just its infallibility, it is also kind of this perfect, contextless, divine revelation of God's nature. That is not an inevitable conclusion. There's a lot of other, contradictory views that say, no, the Quran has context. It's what God said to Muhammad. He might say something different to us. So his words should be taken in the context of the people he's speaking to. In fact, that seems like the most rational answer to me, just taking the text as it sits in front of us. I think any God who speaks to us would speak to us according to our own language, according to our own understanding, and in our own context. And therefore, context would matter. And in fact, he might kind of work within our existing culture and laws. He might not change every law to be perfect. He might just say, hey, let's push this forward a little bit. And if you have that view, you can take even a book like the Quran and say, hey, the Quran says maybe you cut off the hands of thieves, but we don't want to do that anymore. That was the right thing to do back then, but that's not the way we should behave today. And you can move yourself forward. But I'm not claiming that it's impossible to make that sort of progressive interpretation of the Quran. In fact, it's necessary. If we're going to live with Muslims, we have to help people who are believers. We're not going to just make them all stop believing. We're going to have to work with the reformers in Islam to push towards the sort of view I just described. Right? But the Quran, I believe its history makes that harder in a very similar way to the way the Book of Mormon does. For the Book of Mormon, it's a historicity question that's harder. Right? It's harder to say, oh, they're just writing down a myth, because then the whole story of Joseph Smith doesn't make sense. But in the Quran, we have this direct recitation issue, which is a challenge that makes it even harder, I think, than the Bible to create that liberal view. And heaven knows it's hard enough with the Bible. We've got enough fundamentalists, with the biblical text. But knowing what the Quran is, then I think is important as we enter the debate about how to interpret it, because what it is makes that debate, frames that debate. What it's claimed to be frames that debate. So there's several distinctive teachings of Islam. These are the things that you'll just kind of see in a Muslim. These are some of just kind of the core ideas within Islam. They emphasize the oneness of God, especially since it was revealed in contrast to a polytheistic religion of its time. They see Jesus as a prophet and not God. In other words, you can see that they are Unitarian in that they have that sort of similarity with the Unitarian Universalists. They're Unitarians. Jesus was a prophet. He was not God. In fact, they think he never claimed to be God. Biblical verses that say he claimed to be God are corruptions from his later followers who made that claim, but Jesus never actually made that claim. The Quran actually mentions Mary more often than the Bible does. So again, similar cast of characters: Mary, Adam, Abraham, Jesus. But Jesus is now a prophet, not God, and never made such a claim. And in fact, that's a huge blasphemy to claim he's the Son of God. God has no son. They believe in an eternal paradise of heaven and an eternal punishment of hell. So they may be Unitarian, but they are not Universalists. And if you read the Quran, oh my gosh, they are not Universalists. It spends a lot of time talking about the pus and the boils and the flame, and it's very disturbing. As a reader of the Quran, I find those verses disturbing. Those same sort of verses exist in the Bible, but they're on every page in the Quran, and it's not every page, but very close. And it is very disturbing if you just kind of go through and read it. For me, at least, I find that, as a Universalist, I find that disturbing. Interestingly enough, I may or may not be a Unitarian, but I'm certainly a Universalist. So this has this backwards. So let's see. One of my comparative religion teachers once told me, you should find something in every tradition that you admire, or that you have divine. What was the word he used for this? My brain is not behaving itself today, and I can't think of the term. But something you envy, divine envy, something you just kind of wish your tradition also did. And in Islam, there's a connection between beauty and God and good. The good is beautiful, beautiful is good, beauty is good, and God is beautiful. And this kind of connection to beauty has spawned a large amount of very beautiful art. They specifically try not to draw depictions of things, again, to try to avoid idolatry. They get so far away from idolatry that you can't draw pictures of anything. And the result is some of the most beautiful calligraphy the world has ever seen, and geometric art patterns are just phenomenal. And this is an element of their culture and their religion that I admire, and I wish we had more of. And again, this idea that the Quran is the direct and perfect dictation from God, that is not universal, but is a nearly universal belief among among most Muslims. And then this idea that Muhammad grew up in the context of Christianity and Judaism. They existed around him, and he was aware of them both. And so he was aware of the story of Abraham. Abraham had two sons. According to the Jewish tradition, Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac, and an angel came down to spare Isaac at the last minute, and Isaac became the chosen child from whom the Jews and the Jewish people delineate. But Abraham had another son named Ishmael that he exiled out into the wilderness, who went off to Arabia and became the father of the people of Arabia. And so Muhammad seems to have embraced that myth, that his people were the descendants of Ishmael, except he shifts who Abraham almost sacrificed. He taught that Abraham almost sacrificed Ishmael on the altar, and the angel came and saved Ishmael, not Isaac, and therefore his people were the chosen people to have the prophet at the end of time, the last of the prophets, Muhammad. And so this connects Islam to the Judeo-Christian tradition in important and interesting ways, because it becomes, especially when they're in conflict, you can see them as the conflict between two brothers, the ancestors of these two brothers, an interfamily conflict between the sons of Isaac and the sons of Ishmael that were arguing and fighting from the days of biblical times. Another topic that often comes up, especially in our day, is this idea of Sharia law. Sharia law is just Islamic law. The concept of separation of church and state if you were to go and talk to a random Muslim in Southeast Asia and ask if they believe in the possibility of separation of church and state, 99% will say, yeah, sure. Separation of church and state is great. I don't know, I made that number up, 99%, but a majority would agree that there is a possible separation of church and state, and that's the way things should be. But Islamic history had a theocracy. Now, the Quran says there is no compulsion in religion, but Muhammad conquered lots of area and ruled that area as its political as well as its religious leader, and he created a set of law that was based on revelation from God. By the way, that is not dissimilar from the law we see in the Old Testament. The law of Moses, Christians interpret that as a religious law for religious people, the law for the people, but it was a secular law. It's not a law that, it's not like commandments for believers. It's the law, how you punish criminals, the social safety net, all of that is set up in the law of Moses. It's a secular law as well as a religious law. There is no separation of church and state. And so in early Islam, that was also the case. And there are 4 sources in Sunni Islam for Sharia law. The Quran is the first, the Sunnah, or the authentic set of hadith, the Ijma, the consensus of the different Islamic scholars interpreting the Quran and Hadith, and analytical reasoning, which allows you to then say things like this Hadith doesn't make sense because it contradicts the Quran, or this verse in the Quran supersedes this verse because it's a later verse, or whatever you have. That's the analytical reasoning that gets applied. And those are the basis for Sharia law. Sharia law has been an element of conflict because people in the West have often said, Sharia law, we don't want to live under Sharia law, so therefore we don't want a Muslim majority group of people here, therefore we don't want to allow Muslims to immigrate, etc. And Sharia law has been used as one of these arguments. It is true that historically Islam, to fully be a Muslim means to keep the rules for yourself, but to live in an Islamic community. Now notice, in an Islamic community, conversion is not required. Sharia law doesn't force anyone to be a Muslim. In the lands Muhammad conquered, even though his revelation says there is no coercion in Islam, in religion, there should be no coercion in religion, he conquered places, imposed Sharia law, which allowed people to believe anything kind of they wanted. But if you were a member of the people of the book, Jewish or Christian, you had to pay some extra taxes, and there was some disadvantages that you had, and so there was an incentive to convert until the majority of people under Sharia law ended up converting. And so there's obviously some tension there, or this history creates tension between historical Islam and modern secular society that says that we believe in a complete separation of church and state, as well as freedom of conscience when it comes to what religion you should believe. The hijab has also been a point of contention. There are people in the West who see the hijab as a way to dominate and control women. The hijab is the head covering and the headscarf that a lot of women wear. References to it are in the Hadith. In France, it's created controversy because the French tend to ban it when doing things like taking a driver's license photo or going to a French school. Have no idea. I mean, they say they're doing that in the name of separation of church and state, and I look at that and I'm like, that looks like the exact opposite of separation of church and state to me. It looks like you've dictated a religious view on your followers by not allowing them to wear the hijab. The debate then goes back the other way. Well, women who are doing this are not actually choosing to wear it. They're under family social pressure, and so we've got to force them to free themselves. And again, I find that problematic in so many ways. And that's on the one side. On the other side, we have Iran, where the hijab is mandatory. And after the death of Masha Amini, how does she say him? Masha Amini? I've heard her name so many times, you'd think I'd be able to say it correctly. She was a woman who was assaulted by police officers for not properly wearing the hijab and ended up dying in custody, and they argued that she just died of a heart attack and no one believed them, and it sparked massive protests against the regime in Iran, of women saying this should be our choice, not something that's dictated upon us. And so again, this is another one of those flashpoints that Islam has faced with kind of Western society. To end, I want to talk about the 5 pillars of Islam. These are kind of, the view here is of a tent with a central pole in the middle and 4 posts around the edge. The central pole is the declaration of faith, surrounded by ritual prayer, almsgiving, fasting, pilgrimage, and jihad, as sometimes described as a 6th pillar in some circles. The declaration of faith is twofold. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. To become a Muslim, you simply have to say these words with intent and knowledge of what you're saying, and intent to mean it, preferably in the presence of witnesses, and that's what makes you a Muslim. And the other 5 pillars are to support that declaration, to actually make God God in your life without putting yourself ahead of Him implies submission, among other things. Prayer is one of the ways of doing this, and so 5 times a day. There's a beautiful story in Islam about how Moses went up to talk to God, and he commanded that they pray. I don't know, it was like 20-something times a day, and God and Muhammad went down from God and chatted with Moses on the way down, and Moses was like, there ain't no way. I led people. I got God to let me only pray 3 times a day, and my people wouldn't even do that. So you need to go back and ask for less, or your people just won't be able to do it. And so Muhammad goes back up and says, Moses back there says my people can't handle this. We should do this less. And he talks God down to 5. And at 5, God's like, well, you at least got to do better than the Jews, so we're going to do 5 because the Jews do 3. So 5 times a day, Muslims will perform this ritual prayer, which involves standing, bowing, lifting your arms, and then prostrating yourself in abject submission, your forehead to the ground. And people who do this often will sometimes get a mark on their heads, which is sometimes called the mark of submission. Their forehead has been placed to the ground so often. So it's this physical sign of submission. The prayer, people are called to prayer 5 times a day, where loudspeakers on big minarets will often ring out, this call to come and pray 5 times a day. And again, during the prayer, the Quran is read and ritual words are spoken. Again, beautiful Arabic. It's the sound. They fill the area with sacred sound as they prostrate themselves and submit to God. A mosque is known as the place of prostration. That's what mosque means. It's the place of prostration, the place where people prostrate themselves and pray. It starts with water for washing because you enter the space clean. So you have to wash before you enter to become clean. And then you enter and you face the mihrab, which points towards the Kaaba. Originally, Muslims prayed towards Jerusalem. And then when the Jews didn't accept Muhammad as a new prophet to their religion, it was moved to face the Kaaba in Mecca. And then there's usually a minaret where the person would stand on the top and yell out, the call to prayer. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Rashhadu wa ma'ish Muhammadan Rasulallah. I used to be able to sing this. The Arabic class, one of the few things they actually taught us that stuck was we could all sing the call to prayer. And before you would stand on this tall minaret to call people to prayer by yelling. Now they have big loudspeakers up there. The next is zakat, or almsgiving. Again, I apologize if I'm pronouncing these wrong. Giving 2.5% of one's savings to the poor and needy. And there's a lot of different traditions involved here and what you can do. And there's a floor. If you're under this poverty level, you don't have to give alms. And if you're above it, you can give more. And you can give to the synagogue to keep, or the mosque, to keep the mosque running. Or you can give directly to the poor to care for the poor. But it was the idea of creating a community. One of the very pillars of Islam and submission is to create a community that cares for the poor among them. And by the way, that means a social safety net is built into Islam in many ways in a way that it was not built into some of the Western religions.
So is that 2.5% per year?
I need to go back and look. I don't remember. I think so. And it excludes, I read the details this morning and I already don't remember, so I apologize for messing that up to you. But it was because I got bogged down into the details. There were certain things like cars and homes are excluded from how this is calculated. And so the calculation was complicated enough that the simple answer, which I should have remembered, got bogged down in all the details, and now I can't remember the answer to your question. Yeah.
It's just plain socialism, isn't it?
Not exactly, but it's a taxation that goes to the poor, but it's a willing tax given by the believers that goes to the poor. And that was on top of a taxation that then the nation would impose on people to run the government and things. Yeah.
When you give to the poor, do you decide who is poor, or is there some agent?
You can do it both. I've seen individual Muslims interpret it both ways, but I believe there's one way that's implied by the consensus of the community, in Sunni Islam at least, and I do not remember which one is which. I have a Muslim friend who chooses the poor himself because he doesn't trust, his mosque community to do so. But I don't know if that's a typical response or a more typical one. I don't know. Swam fasting. Fasting is a part of Christianity, Judaism as well, but in Islam there's a 1 month, and it floats around our calendar because they have a lunar calendar, so it kind of moves around 11 days every year. But there's a month where they fast from sundown to sunup. They abstain from food, sex, smoking, and I can't remember, and drink water during the entire month, and then they have a big feast at the end. And this is to again help create humility, to see your when I would fast as a Mormon, it would knock me out, and I'd realize my reliance on food and God and the people around me. Take food away from me for one day, and I'm done for. It creates this extra piece of humility. It's also a time to give to the poor, remember the hungry by joining the hungry. But it also creates a potential opening for spiritual experiences. Anyone who's done this for a long time themselves has noticed certain spiritual experiences. It also creates an interesting situation where just before sunup and just after sundown, the family tends to get together and have meals together, and it creates a very interesting family dynamic that's useful. And again, is one of the things I actually admire about Islam. This is my sacred envy. And then the last of these 5 is the Hajj, the pilgrimage. Once in a lifetime, if you're able, you're supposed to visit the Kaaba in Mecca. This is the shrine that Muhammad cleansed, that he said was built by Adam and refurbished by Abraham and cleansed of its idols by Muhammad. And we will have a long discussion of the Hajj at a later date. But this is a very complicated ritual, including throwing some stones in a certain run and then circumambulating the Kaaba, praying towards the Kaaba, etc. And you're supposed to do this. Everyone wears white clothing, simple, so everyone is dressed the same, etc. Those are the 5 pillars, but sometimes jihad is listed as a 6th. That is not a technically correct sort of terminology in early Islam, but it is often listed as one of the pillars that is not one of the pillars. And jihad simply means to strive. And Muslims will often talk about what they call the lesser striving and the greater striving. The lesser striving is war with your neighbors. Striving against the enemies of Islam who are trying to do harm to the people of Islam, you're allowed to defend yourself and fight them, and that is the lesser jihad. Because the greater jihad is this internal struggle to submit and to control yourself. I have a friend who works in the lab complex whose middle name is Jihad. And her parents happily named her this before 9/11. And then she decided to work for the U.S. government with a security clearance. And of course, I'm sure her name causes all sorts of consternation. Because we have this concept of jihad as war, and her parents weren't even thinking about that, I think, when they named her this. It was the struggle to be good and to obey God and to submit to God, and they wanted that struggle to be part of her life. It was a beautiful thing, and so they named her Jihad, and then we have a much darker view of what jihad means because of recent events that has clouded our interactions with Islam. So we have to somehow reckon with, and I'm going to have, I believe, a whole lecture on this topic, the issue of violence in Islam. And there are 3 approaches to this, and I'm going to give the 3 and tell you why I prefer the one I prefer. And the first is the antagonistic view. And this is the approach of the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and that's to say Islam is evil. Its belief in the afterlife makes people willing to kill themselves. Its belief in 10 virgins that you get to 7, whatever it is you get to have if you die in holy jihad, makes people willing to kill themselves. And if people are willing to kill themselves to right wrongs, whatever, then they're also willing to, use a nuclear weapon to blow up the world. And therefore, Islam is a threat to world existence. We need to do something about this. This is the antagonistic view towards Islam. The problem with it is that it feeds the very concept of this war between and incompatibility with Islam, between the West and Islam. And the more you feed that, the more you feed the jihadists who say, well, if there's this conflict and even the other side agrees they can't get along with us, then we have to fight for our own survival because they don't even think they can get along with us. And from my perspective, this makes things worse because you're not going to successfully talk these people out of their belief by mentioning that some of them are violent, and only some of them are violent. It also, blames everybody for the actions of a few that most Muslims don't agree with. And so this is a problem. But the other problem, and this is often espoused by what I would call the illiberal left, is the apologetic view. And that is, well, those weren't real Muslims. Real Muslims don't do stuff like that. And this is the no true Scotsman fallacy, and this ignores the way Islamic traditions and teachings did influence the terrorists who attacked the trade towers on 9/11 and have committed other heinous acts of terrorism. They are influenced by Islamic teachings, and if we pretend Islam has nothing to do with it, we misdiagnose the problem. And if we misdiagnose the problem, we do not reach a solution. So how do we properly and we are not allowed to then criticize the issues with Islam that maybe are causing this issue. So what do we do instead? And I believe the solution that avoids what I would call Islamophobia. Islamophobia is an overused term. Anyone who criticizes anything is named Islamophobic. But there is real Islamophobia too. And so I believe the way you avoid that, while allowing yourself the freedom to see the problem clearly and to recognize the issues involved here, is to recognize the diversity of the tradition. Islam is a massive tradition of millions of people. They do not all agree. Just look at the Shia-Sunni split. But within Sunni Islam, there's massive diversity, from extremist, jihadist, terrorists on one hand, to reform, feminist thinkers and writers on the other, with beautiful poets in the middle. And we haven't even talked about the Sufis and the vast diversity that this tradition encompasses. Both of the other two approaches overgeneralize. They do not recognize the true diversity of the tradition. Authentic Islam is diverse, unless you have a specific point where you're trying to be normative and say, this is the way you must be in Islam, and all other forms of Islam are wrong. Unless you're going to do that, then you have to recognize its diversity. From the jihadists on the one hand, which is an authentic form of Islam, to the reformist liberals on the other hand, which is also an authentic form of Islam. And you recognize the diversity, and then you're free to criticize the forms of Islam that violate freedom for women or for homosexuals, or put homosexual people to death, or do other things that conflict with our values dramatically and in dramatic and important ways. We are free to confront that, to see it clearly, and to speak out against it without speaking out against all Muslims, because we recognize the diversity of the traditions. And within that recognition of diversity, we have to find our allies within the tradition and support them. And because that's the only way we're going to make progress. We're not going to make progress by talking people out of being Muslim. We're going to make progress by supporting the reformers within the tradition to the best of our ability. And sometimes that means getting out of the way if our support makes their position worse. Because it can, right? If they're trying to speak to other Muslims, knowing that a bunch of Unitarian Universalists in America are on their side, that can make their situation worse. And we need to get out of the way sometimes. So my approach to confronting violence in Islam is, it's a trite statement, but it's a not all Muslims right approach. That if you do not recognize the diversity in Islam, you're missing the boat. And that goes for the apologists and that goes for the antagonistic view as well. Both of them are not recognizing the full range of diversity. Now, I've struggled to figure out how to talk about Islam and how to put together a series of lectures on Islam because there's so much to talk about. Today we've done the introduction, but we can also talk about the life of Muhammad. We can talk about the Quran itself, read verses, talk about its interpretation, the history of its interpretation, go into details that I breezed over today and probably did wrong. I can go back and do that right. We can talk about Mecca and the Hajj, the details of the rituals involved, where it came from, some of its connections to earlier temple traditions. We can talk about later Islamic history up through the Crusades. We can talk about the Crusades themselves. We haven't even mentioned Sufi mystical traditions in Islam and the beautiful poetry that comes with some of that. We certainly need to talk about Islam and the modern challenges, which we breezed over there at the end. With these approaches to violence in Islam. And I also really want to get to How Jesus Became God by Bart Ehrman. I'm going to go through some of that information. I really want to. But if I do these once a month, we're looking at half a year to a year of, especially if I keep missing classes for family emergencies, this could take a while. So if you're online, you put in the comments what you want to see, but also I'm going to come around here after and just chat with you guys, and we'll talk about how many of these lectures on Islam you actually want to see, how much time you want to spend on it. I will say that my background was in ancient Near Eastern history. So once Alexander conquered, the Middle East, I lost all interest. And so from my perspective, it was Egypt, Mesopotamia, ancient Israel, Canaanite religion, Syrian religion, Hittite. That stuff fascinated me, and I spent a lot of time learning about it, which means that Islam is something I've kind of taught myself, since I left the LDS, the Mormon Church, and became a Unitarian Universalist. On the other hand, so I don't know as much about it. I did spend a semester in Jerusalem, and we took courses on Jewish history and Islamic history, one from a Muslim, one from a Jew, which was very interesting to see the Palestinian conflict through those eyes, to hear a Jewish person talk about the conflict, one lecture, and then go across the hall and listen to a Palestinian talk about the same conflict and the way they were living in different worlds and saw the entire world differently was just fascinating. But that's the extent of my background in this subject. That being said, Islam plays such an important role in our current society and our current society's problems that it feels important to me. And so as much as intellectually I'd love to go chat about the origins of early Christianity and how those theological ideas evolved, I think it's important to do justice to Islam. And so let's have a conversation about how many of these lectures we want to do, how much time we want to spend on Islam over the next half a year before we dive into the origins of Christianity. I want to give you some additional resources. The Great Courses has a comparative religion course by Professor Charles Kimball, which was excellent. It has several chapters on Islam. Cultural literacy for religion, everything the well-educated person should know. Also, by Great Courses, Professor Mark Berkson. By the way, I have poor eyes, so I love to listen to things, so I tend to listen. I used to read all day, and now my eyes burn, so I sit and listen to audiobooks all day. This is why so many of my recommended readings are these things you can listen to. But then God is Not One by Stephen Prothero. Those are 3 comparative religion book texts that have overviews of many different religious traditions with chapters on Islam. So if your interest is in overviews of religious traditions, these are the sources, and this one is my favorite. God is Not One by Stephen Prothero. So let me go through these again, because I know, see, you're writing these down. Comparative Religion by Professor Charles Kimball. Cultural Literacy for Religion, Everything the Well-Educated Person Should Know by Professor Mark Berkson. And God is Not One by Stephen Prothero. This one is my favorite. 90% of what I talked about today came from this text. But if you want a deeper dive into Islam, Great World Religions, Islam. This one's by Professor John L. Esposito. This was okay. I learned a lot. He has a very distinct, very specific view of Islam that was interesting, but very kind of reform Islamic oriented. Karen Armstrong, she's known for her kind of all religions are different paths up the same mountain approach to religion, which is very much what Stephen Prothero is talking about being wrong, I might add, when he says God is not one, the religions really are different. But she tries to show, she focuses on their similarities, and she had a text on Islam that was reasonably good. This was amazing from my perspective. I felt like this taught me the most. The Life and Legacy of Muhammad by Maria Dakaki. Maria Dakaki. This was amazing. I learned so much that I did not know. She discusses Muhammad's life, the details of his life, the details of his marriages, including his polygamous marriages, very, very high detail, excellent text. If I do a lecture on the life of Muhammad, this will be the primary source. Very good material. And then for that last one, the conflict, modern conflict and the issues with Islam, I highly recommend this. If you have a few hours to listen to something, this was amazing. Islam and the Future of Tolerance, a dialogue by Sam Harris and Majid Hawaz. Majid Hawaz is a believer. Sam Harris is a very famous new atheist of the all religion is the world's problem, and Islam is evil and is going to lead to us all dying sort. And this puts them in a room and lets them talk at each other. And their dialogue is interesting and kind of, in my perspective, shows some path forwards. Although I disagree dramatically with Sam Harris on his approach to a lot of this stuff. And despite that, this dialogue was really good. Forcing these people to talk to each other was very what I would consider informative. All right, are there any last-minute burning questions or thoughts before we? All right. Let's chat for a minute after, and I'm grateful for all of you for coming. Thank you so much for being here. I hope what we shared helps you in your life's journey, and I hope to see you next month. Bye.